You're listening to the AmWritingFantasy Podcast. In today's publishing landscape, you can reach fans all over the world. Query letters are a thing of the past. You don't even need a literary agent. There is nothing standing in the way of making a living from writing. Join two best-selling authors who have self-published more than 20 books between them. Now, on to the show with your hosts, Autumn Burt and Jasper Schmidt.
Hello, I am Jesper, and this is episode 79 of the AmWritingFantasy Podcast. And as you can hear, Autumn is taking a break today, and instead I'm joined by Kristina Stanley, who is the CEO of Fictionary. And Fictionary is a platform run by Kristina and her husband. Kristina is a best-selling author and a fiction editor, and we are going to talk about editing today. So welcome to the AmWritingFantasy Podcast, Kristina.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I actually did a check on the Fictionary website earlier today, Kristina, and I saw you actually had quite a nice description of how and why Fictionary started. And I was thinking that might be a good place to start if you could retell a bit of that story so our listeners as well get to know you a little better here.
Sure, I'd love to. I mean, who doesn't like talking about their story?
Exactly.
Yeah, so Fictionary came to be from my writing career, and I started that in around 2009, and I started writing the Stone Mountain series. And I started writing that because I just left living in a ski resort and I missed it and I wanted to write about it. And what I found after I had 3 novels in this series written, I was having trouble editing it and keeping track of everything. And I had this massive spreadsheet organized. And my husband actually walked by and looked at my computer and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm writing." He's like, "In Excel?" And I said, "Well, okay, I'm actually editing and I need to keep track and this is how I do it." And he said, "Oh, there's got to be a better way. I'll find you something." And so he went on the search, of course, for a product that would help me. And there just wasn't anything that focused on story editing. There's lots for copy editing and proofreading, but really nothing on the structure of a story. And the two of us decided together that we would build a product. And that was kind of the beginning of it. It was just sort of a idea of, well, let's make an app and see what happens.
So is it more like an app that keeps track of everything, or how does it work?
So it's how it works. So we like to focus on people who have a draft written. You can write from scratch in Fictionary, but that's not really our thing. Our thing is if you have a draft written, you import it into Fictionary, and Fictionary scans it. And when it's scanning it, it draws the story arc and it compares it to a commercially successful book of around the same length and gives the writer right away a look at where their key plot points are for exciting incident, etc., and are they in the right place. It does word count per scene and shows you in a visual way. So here's your word count per scene, and so you can see what your pacing is doing, and do you have any outliers that are just too long or too short or something. And it pulls out, using natural language processing, it pulls out all of the character names and links them to scenes, and then shows a writer how many characters are in each scene and when they come in, who's got the point of view and how many point of view characters there are and stuff. And so it's a very visual way for a writer to look at their story. And then because it's all broken out and organized into scenes and chapters, we push scene by scene editing, and we have 38 story elements there that help the writer know what to look at when they're evaluating their own story.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I don't, as you said in the beginning, I can't think of any other product exactly like that. I mean, I know of other products where you can use it to sort of structure, characters. You can connect them together visually as well, and you can, the whole world building part that comes with fantasy, for example, you can connect all the places together in a visual fashion. I know tools like that, but not really tools where I can think of where you can upload your draft like that.
Yeah, and part of historically this happened because I have a degree in computer mathematics, and my husband has a degree in computer science, and so even though I'm a writer, I have a very techie background. And so I was naturally drawn to this side of it and to figure out how this would all work and how would you draw a story arc and make these things happen. So it really, really entertained both sides of my brain to work on this and build it.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. Okay, well, that's actually pretty cool. And maybe we can, at the end of the episode, we can just make sure we give people a link so they can go and check that out.
Sure.
Is there any like trial versions or stuff like that, or demo versions people can use?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a 2-week free trial. So you just pop in your manuscript and you have a look around. We have online chat so people can ask us questions on how to use it. And when people sign up to the free trial, they also get a 14-lesson online course that goes with it that teaches all of the story elements and why they're important and how to use them and what it means to you as a writer. And so there's a whole educational piece that goes with it to help people as they work through Fictionary. And our kind of dream is that once you go through it once, then the next time you write a novel, it's much easier because you have all of this in your head and you know how to start a scene, end a scene, all of these things that especially newer writers, you have to learn how to do.
Yeah, the whole structure of a novel. I mean, there is a formulaic approach to structuring a novel, and while we as authors needs to understand how that formula works and how to put all those different milestones at the right places in a novel, the reader don't really understand those, but they intuitively know. So if it's off, they will intuitively sort of feel like there's something wrong with the structure of the story, but they won't be able to pinpoint what it is. But
and that's
we as authors really need to understand that.
It's a super important point because what we're trying to do with Fictionary is make the author aware of it. And so if you do decide to break the rules, know why you're doing it. And then you're making an educated decision on, well, that doesn't work for my story and I have a reason for it, and that's great, as opposed to just getting it wrong and then you don't know why your story's not working.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, that's very good. But I also know, based on the whole thing you have developed here, Kristina, that you really like editing. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I do. It's kind of funny that I had no idea when I started writing that really my true passion is editing. I love working with writers. We developed an editor product to go along with our writing product just for editors to do structural edits in it, with the dream that we can make editors really strong editors. And so I edit maybe one novel a month just to keep my skill set up, but it's not my main focus. We're really focused now on pushing Fictionary editor version out to editors, which we call Story Coach. And it's really meant to help an editor do a comprehensive story edit without being biased. So it makes it really objective and they have to cover everything, and it ends up being a really good edit for the writer.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've actually come quite a long way from when you were first sitting with that Excel sheet and this is how I'm editing to now, where you both built this app here, but also teaching other people how to edit.
Yeah, and so we've got we have a Fictionary certified story coach editing program that we bring editors through to teach them how to do a proper structural edit and then certify them so that when a writer hires an editor, they know what they're getting and they know that person really understands story, versus hiring an editor that maybe thinks they do or has certain biases of how they edit. And we're trying to push editors to get a little bit away from that.
Yeah, but you see, this is exactly why I wanted you to come on the podcast today, because you have an excellent approach here and a very strong background in educating us here on the podcast a bit about how do we go about editing, and especially also when authors are self-editing their work, and maybe a good place to start would be just, so when you start editing a new manuscript, what is the first thing you do? Do you just start from page 1 and then you start editing, or do you read through it in a high-level pass first, or what do you do? Yeah,
so we like to first think for newer authors, authors who are more experienced, they're a little bit farther along, but for newer author, the most important thing is to understand what a scene is and look through their manuscript and make sure that they have their scene structure done right first. And so what I encourage writers to do, if they're already broken out into scenes and chapters, that's great. Then I'll tell you a bit where you would start at that point. But there are many newer writers who have written their novel and it's not properly structured into stories or into scenes. And so what I recommend is first going through and looking for logical places to start scenes without thinking about word count. That can come later, but just to look through and go, okay, so the point of view has changed, or the point of view character has changed. That's a good place to start a new scene. Or the location has changed, or the timing has changed. These are 3 key areas where a writer can go through and read their manuscript. Don't focus on words and copy editing or anything like that. Just go through and look for the points where you would break out a scene. And once you've done that, it's amazing how you can see the structure of your story just by having it broken into scenes. And it's a big eye opener when you do that for the first time. It's really kind of fun. And you can see how many scenes you have. And once you've done that, then you can start looking at all of the other things you need to do for a story edit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes it can be confusing for a new author when you start doing the editing, because there's a tendency to, well, okay, I start on page 1 and then I will start looking at commas or spelling errors or making the sentences sound a bit better. Right. But I think there's a very good point in looking at the overall structure first. And even if you don't have something like Fictionary to help you, then at least educate yourself by, reading maybe nonfiction books about how to plot a novel and understand the structure of it. And then start there to see where you're off.
And it's super important not to waste time on making a sentence beautiful. I mean, some people do it naturally. Some people really struggle. You have to spend a lot of time, and not to spend time on the commas and typos and all of those things until you have a story, because what's going to happen once you've broken out everything into scenes, you're going to realize that, okay, you have a lot of revisions to do. And if you spend hours making everything perfect at the sentence level, but your story's off, you have to rewrite it anyway. And then you have to copy it all over again. And I certainly don't recommend paying for a copy edit or proofreading until you've done your own story edit. That you will have to do it again. And it's kind of a waste of money if you do it too early.
Yeah. So what's your view on these revision passes? How many is there any recommendation you would give to say, okay, you do one pass in the high level story elements, and one pass in looking at the copy edit, and then you do a third pass proofreading, and then you hand it off to a copy editor or something? Or do you have like a work methodology that you follow with regards to that?
Yeah. So again, it depends on the level of where the author is in their career and how many books they've written, because the more books you write, obviously the easier it becomes, and you know how to structure, and so you can start it in different places. But the basic thing is, once everything is broken out into scenes, then I like to recommend that the author now goes through and names each scene in 3 words or less. And the reason I say this is, if you can't name a scene, you don't know what it's about. So you should be able to name every scene in your story. And by doing that, it tells you, does it have a place in this story? So does it have a purpose in my story? And everybody gets carried away writing, and you write this fantastic scene and you love it, but it has nothing to do with your story. It's just a great scene about the character, right? You think, oh, okay. So if you can't define the name and the purpose of that scene, then perhaps it shouldn't be in the story. And so it's a good place to start looking at high level. Do you, as an author, understand why you put every scene in your story?
Yeah, fully agree with that, for sure.
So it's a big step. I mean, it takes time, right? You have to really think hard when you're doing it.
Yes, indeed. But is there like something that you would say, so you have edited tons of manuscripts. So is there something that you would say, maybe we could put them into different buckets here? So sort of saying bucket 1 being the fledgling writer who's just starting out, and maybe another bucket with the more experienced writer. But is there some common issues that you see that is very in both buckets? Because I think that they will be different, but is there like common issues that you see popping up over and over again from the stuff that you edit?
Yeah, so the big things that show up, the thing I see most often is people don't know when to start and end a scene. So even if their story is broken into scenes, they're starting a scene at the wrong place or ending it at the wrong place. And what I mean by that is if when you think about as a reader, when you're reading a book and you're kind of getting tired and you kind of peek at the next scene to see if you want to keep reading, you're going to read 3 or 4 sentences, and if it captures you right away, like, okay, I'm going to keep reading. I'll get one more scene in. I'll feel all accomplished. It's great, right? If you look at it and think, kind of boring, you put the book down and you might not pick it back up. Or when you pick it back up, you're a little bit out of the flow. So having an entry hook, there's a lot of stuff written about the first sentence of your novel has to be the best, and your opening hook of your novel has to be the best. But I believe the opening hook of every scene has to be strong, because every time you start a new scene, there's a chance for the reader to put that book down. They finish a scene, and if they're not engaged in the next scene, and so I often look right away to see how is the author doing their entry hooks. And then at the end of the scene, I want to see how are they leaving the scene, and do they leave it at the right point? And often you can just cut off the last 2 paragraphs and there's the right point to leave it. So you leave it with an unanswered question, or someone just spilled a big secret that they shouldn't have, or a cliffhanger. There's a really intriguing piece of dialogue, or a revelation, or part of a revelation, or something like that, so that at the end of the scene, the reader is feeling, okay, I have to keep reading. And you'll notice really good books all have a great entry and exit hook for every single scene. And it's hard to do because you try and fill in with description and have a lot of ambiance around it. And if your skill set isn't quite there yet on how to make that suspenseful, it's tricky to do it.
Yeah, Autumn and I, we plot our novels in quite a lot of detail, but that's also, of course, because we are co-writing, so we need to know where things are going. So we have quite a lot of details, but I would say, especially with what you just mentioned here, the beginnings of each chapter and also the end of each chapter, we spent quite a lot of time in the plotting phase detailing out how is this going to start and how is it going to end. And we try to be a bit creative as well, so that every chapter doesn't end the same way.
Perfect.
It shouldn't be that every time a chapter ends, the monster appears or whatever,
Right. Yep.
So, but I think if it doesn't come natural to you for the writer to find the right place to stop the scene or whatever, a lot of it can be gained by just planning out ahead,
Right.
Figuring out ahead, how do you want this one to end, and find a good cliffhanger or something to end on.
And really it just comes down to thinking about it, and to know that you need to think about it as a writer. And once you have that in your head, even when you're writing and you write an unplanned scene, it's there in your head, you know it. And so you write that way. And it's really the first time going through it, really learning this is how you do it. And of course, experienced authors make mistakes too, and you put too much in, and then your editor comes and goes, hey, take all of that out. And, you cringe and you take it all out.
Yes, that's absolutely true. But I also think when we're talking about scenes or chapters, or however somebody wants to, whatever they want to call it, but when we're talking about that and we're talking about starting points and end points, I think that there is also something that I could imagine, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but I could imagine what you would also see quite often as an issue is that there is not enough variation on high conflict versus low conflict chapters. So that you can read several chapters with high conflict in a row, that's not really a problem. But if you read 15 of them in a row, then you're going to get tired. You need a break, and the reader needs a break once in a while.
Yep. Yeah. And the tricky part comes, so when you give the reader a break, you want to go maybe into a contemplative scene where your character is reacting to something. And those are hard scenes to write, because you want to get the character's feelings out, and how is it changing them, and what decisions are they going to make based on it. And so it's a really great time to connect your readers to your characters when you get to those contemplative scenes. And if they're placed right, within exactly what you're saying, that you've got action, 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 a bit of a sequel, okay, gives your reader a breath. And then they also feel it along with the character. So it's very important.
Yeah, and I feel a lot of the time those bit of a break chapter, if we call it that, those are excellent tools to use for the character arc, to basically build upon the character arc and how they change throughout the novel. You can use those if you have like 5 of the slow chapters throughout the entire novel. Those are excellent 5 different points where you can show that the character is going through the character arc, because they are good reflective scenes. So they're good. They're put to good use there.
Well, and you know whose book is really good on this is Sacha Black's book that just came out that's called Anatomy of Prose. And she has super examples in there of exactly what we're talking about. And she gives a way of writing it that goes, this is good. And then she rewrites it and you can see this is great. And it's exactly what you're saying about the character arc. And it's a great book. So anyone who's working on that, I totally recommend that book.
Yes, absolutely. And also for the listener, if you forgot, we actually have Sacha Black on this podcast as well. I don't recall the episode number on the top of my head here, but if you go back through the archive, you can certainly find it when we talk to Sacha Black. So she knows what she's talking about. So that's very good as well. What I was also wondering, and this is sort of something that pops up over and over and over again, Autumn and I also do courses for authors and stuff like that. So we also heavily into the teaching. So we hear a lot of the common questions. And I think this is probably a good one to cover here as well, because it is something a lot of people are wondering about. And I have my clear view on it, but I'm curious to hear yours first. But it basically goes something like this. So when you're writing, is it best to edit as you go? Because then when you reach the end of the manuscript, you are sort of done. Or is it better to just write out the entire manuscript, not worrying about any of the editing or any of the grammar errors you might be making along the way, and then edit only once you have the full first draft complete?
Okay, I'm going to give you a big caveat on this one.
Okay.
So I think it's good to get your story down and write your whole story. But sometimes your brain is tired, but you want to do something productive. And so maybe you want to do some copy editing of stuff you've written when you don't have your whole story written. And I actually think it's not a bad thing to do, because then you practice it and you can start to see where your weaknesses are and what you need to fix and what you might want to look at when you're doing a full copy edit. So, I have author friends who perfect each scene, but they've done a very serious outline. Kind of, it sounds like what you do. The outline is written. They know what their story is. They know what's going in every scene, and they know how to write a story. And so they write their scene and then they perfect it and they go to the next one. For other people who are, what are called pantsters, writing by the seat of your pants, like to get the whole story out. And so there's a lot of personal preference. I believe that there should be a lot of joy in writing. And so to force yourself to do it one way or another, if it makes you unhappy, it's not the right way for you as an author. I'm a big proponent of finish your story and then do all your copy editing and proofreading. However, if it's not what works best for you and your process, don't change it because somebody else told you to.
Right. No, I think that's actually a fair and good answer. In my view, normally, I would say as well that it sort of depends a bit. I think a lot of the people who are doing the edit as they go, they also use the editing as a bit of a procrastination tool. So it's like, I don't quite know what to write, so I'll keep editing my previous chapters. So they don't really move ahead. And if that's the case, then I think it's an issue.
Yes.
And then you need to press forward, because as you also said, I'm also usually advocating it's more important to get to the end of the draft than it is to make it sound nice as you go.
Yeah.
But when I say that, I also have to say that for some people, it is just incredibly annoying to know that there is a spelling error on page 45 and they almost can't get it out of their head. So if it really annoys you that much, then correct those small spelling errors as you go. If you really can't see past it.
Yeah.
That's better than getting annoyed about it, I think.
Yeah, and I think as you write more books, your process changes as you go because your strengths change and your interests change and the technology changes. And so you don't need to get stuck in one way. You try one. If it doesn't work for you, try something else. And don't be afraid to try something else.
Yeah, and I think it also ties back into how much you're actually plotting the novel in advance, because as you alluded to before, if you really know everything that needs to happen already, then basically Autumn and I, we can sort of edit as you go. I can write a draft first chapter, and then she can edit it while I write chapter 2. And that's possible because we know exactly what's going to happen, and we've been around the bush enough to know how to do it. But yeah, I think as well that it is something that evolves over time. But it is just if you don't get to the end of the first draft before 8 years have passed, well, I guess that's okay. But on the other hand, it's not going to help you at least earn any income from writing if it takes you that long to. So you also need to sort of push yourself forward.
Yeah, and that's hard. There at some point you have to let somebody else read your story, and that first time you do that is really difficult. It's a kind of a frightening moment because you've spent, maybe at least a year on it, and then someone else is going to have comments after they spend a few hours reading it, right?
Yes.
It's a hard moment.
It is very hard. I still remember when I gave my first book to a critique partner, and he was just like, "No, that's just, oh my God, I spent so much time on it," and he just said, "No, this doesn't work."
Mm-hmm. I know it's hard, and as an editor, I have to be very careful with writers to make sure I point out, here are the places that you're really good. So there are strengths here, and here's why I'm saying maybe you want to change something. That from an editor perspective, it's really important not to demotivate a writer and make them feel like they're not good at writing a story, because everybody can be, and it just takes a bit of hard work and some time.
Yeah, and don't you think as well that one of the problems or challenges we have here is also, I mean, of course you can take like what is it called, like an MFA or whatever it's called, a degree in writing, but even with a degree, the only way you learn how to write is by writing. It's not like a carpenter who will go to carpenter school and he'll be an apprentice for a while and then he will know how to do carpenting. It's not like that with writing, right? I mean, of course, in one way you could say that it is like that because you keep writing and you get editing and then you get better. But it is different in the way that it's not like you go to a school and then you get some grades and you'll know if you're good or bad. It's like, right, you could spend 2 years writing something and then you give it to the editor who knows what they're doing, and then you hear the hard truth, right? So it is tough, but I fully agree with you that it's important as well. On one hand, of course, I would expect from an editor who knows what they're doing and who are good at it, that they also know how to give feedback in a good manner so you don't scare people off, because it's a vulnerable process, right?
Of course it is. Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you wanna seriously get into writing and also write for commercial purposes to earn money from it, you also have to take it, because if the editor might be nice and professional in the way that they word things, but the reviewers on Amazon are not. They're just going to slam you. So you just have to learn it.
Yeah, it's true. You do. I just went through a process. I had 13 editors edit the same manuscript. And it's a manuscript that I wrote with some holes in it as a bit of a test. And it was very interesting to see the breadth of the way people pointed out issues. And most of the editors caught all the same issues. And there was sort of the one end of super positive feedback that, so while you're dealing with the issues, you felt good about, oh, that works, that's great. You feel really good, to the other end of, well, that didn't work because whatever reason. And it was quite hard. And you think, ouch, that's just too hard. And if that had been my experience as a new author, it's quite frightening, right? That's not good. Versus the other ones who it's super important to point out why something works and that an author is particularly good at whatever, maybe entry hooks or whatever it is. So it was kind of an interesting experiment to go through to see how that many people would edit the exact same story.
Yeah, and there is, well, at least it's good to hear that they sort of caught the same things. And then, of course, the feedback element is more like the how do you treat other humans in terms of giving them feedback. And that's, I mean, I've worked in management for many years, and it's one of the things you have to learn. If you have an employee who is not performing, it doesn't help to shout them in the face, right? I mean, it's much better if you can find a motivational way of telling them that there's things that we could do in a bit smarter way that will also help you, and then help them along the way rather than putting them down, right?
Yep. And I love it when you can see an author grow and change, and their story just keeps getting better. And it's really fun when that happens.
Yeah. But I'm curious as well, Kristina. So when you just said an author grow, because I'm also curious, have your process for editing changed over time? I mean, editors also grow in their skill of editing. So is there something that you do differently nowadays compared to what you used to do when editing?
Yeah. So when I used to edit, I mean, I would read a story and go through it in MS Word and, edit based on the knowledge in my head. And now I use my own product story coach, because all of the story elements are there, and it makes me look at every scene for the writer and go, okay, what's the conflict in this scene? What's the tension in this scene? What's the backstory? Is there a flashback? You can't get away with, you read a scene, you think, oh, that was pretty good, and you move on. You can find a lot more when you're looking at key story elements to see, are they in every scene? And you can give really in-depth feedback. And now when I write a summary letter to an editor or to a writer, it'll be somewhere around 5,000 words of high-level comments for their story. And then I do, for every scene, I have notes on that particular scene of what worked or needs improvement. And then I mark up all the story elements, and I give them a nice big check mark if it's awesome and they did it great. Or I give a specific feedback to, maybe I can't figure out what the purpose of a scene is. And so I'll put a note, I don't know what the purpose is. Sometimes when you read the whole book, you can go, oh, I get the purpose of that scene now. But when you first read it, you can't quite figure it out. And so, for example, if I say a book has 70 scenes and, 15 of them, I don't know what the purpose is, that tells me the writer's a little bit lost. And it gives me a way to really focus and be specific and say, you have 17 scenes and 15 of them don't have a purpose. So we need to work on that piece of why that is and what we want to do about it.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I was just, while you were saying that, I was just thinking about how it must be sometimes as well when you're editing fantasy novels, because one of the really tricky parts that I guess maybe we have it in common with sci-fi authors, but in general, fantasy and sci-fi at least, we always have to walk that really careful balance between the info dumping versus giving the information through the narrative. But you also have to give some information, just like, here it is, this is explained now, and hopefully only in one sentence so that it's quick and done and over with. But it is a incredibly difficult line to walk sometimes.
It is, because you do need the information there. And of course, the talented authors put out a lot of that information they can give through action by what the character touches or feels or sees. You can do it through the point of view description so that they're feeling something while they're seeing something. And that makes it a little bit, it's more engaging for the reader. And then it as an author when I have to say something very specific about the setting or some magic capability or whatever, because I just have to say it. And as long as you know that, and when you place it in, you want to make it as smooth as possible.
Yeah. But do you see, so when you're working with a lot of different editors, do you see that each editor also have their own view on how is too much info dumping, for example, versus when this is okay? Because at least if I look at written fantasy novels, even from some of the very, very popular fantasy authors, I'm not going to name any names here, but I have read fantasy novels as well written by massive global bestseller authors, and I don't quite like it. It's just not my cup of tea. And I have a feeling that I think that this is very much, and I fully agree with the fact, I should back up and say, I fully agree with the fact that there is a right way and a wrong way to some extent in doing it. You can't fill 1.5 page with info dumping about a culture just because you want to tell the reader about it. That's not what I'm saying here. But what I'm more saying is that I think there is in terms of how to do it, there is sort of a degree in how much is too much versus how much is too little.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing might be a bit on personal preference, but I don't know what your view is, because you edited hundreds and hundreds of novels. So, but how do you view that?
I'll give a tip to writers. If you use beta readers, it's a specific question you can ask your beta readers. But so first, from an editor's point of view, what I tell editors is the second you start to skim, there's something wrong. And if you think it's the info dump thing because there's too much there and you're starting to skim through it, you got to mark that and then look at that and go, why am I skimming here? Well, maybe it's because there's too much information on this new city setting and there's no character interaction with that setting. It's just a 2.5 page description of some city and you don't know why it relates to the plot or the character. So skimming is a big tip to an editor to right away go, oh, okay, what's happening here in the story? And the other thing for info dump too little, if as an editor you get confused, it's probably not enough information in there and the writer could put more in. And, editors read very carefully and they pay attention to story. And so if an editor gets confused, the writer should listen to that and should go, okay, I confused the editor. They don't know what's happening here, or they don't understand why this was possible. You need to pay attention to it because they are reading very carefully. Now, also as an editor, I have to caution that if you start to skim, make sure it's not just because you're tired and you've been editing for too long. So, an hour is good. And then after that, for me personally, I got to step up and do something else because then I can't pay attention as hard as I'm paying attention when I'm fresh. And so skimming doesn't automatically mean there's too much of an info dump. It could just mean I'm tired, but it's a big trigger. And what I wanted to say for readers, when you have beta readers, sometimes, especially if they're friends and family, they don't want to tell you what they don't like. But if you just ask them, please just mark every place you start to skim. You can't hurt my feelings. I just need to know this. You can then, as a writer, look at that and go, is that in an info dump? Is this boring? What's going on here? And if you have 2 or 3 beta readers who mark the same passage as they're skimming, then you know for sure there's something wrong with it.
Yeah, I quite like that approach that you're mentioning there, Kristina, I must say, because what I normally say is that if you, at least if you're starting out, I normally caution authors very, very much on using beta readers, because in my view, it is 100 times better to either hire an editor who knows what they're doing and who can help you, or find a critique partner who also know what they're doing and listen to one person. Because especially when you're starting out, you're getting, let's say, 30 beta readers, and they will give you 30 different points that they like or dislike, and they will also be contradictory to each other. Yeah. So, and when you're starting out, it's more confusing than helpful because you don't know either what is right or wrong. So you're hoping that you're going to get 30 pieces of feedback that is all aligned and will help you understand, okay, I see. And then you can move on for it. But that's not the reality of it. You're going to get 30 strange topics popping up all over the place, and it's not helpful at all. So, but I like the approach about if you only say what you just said, just highlight the places where your eyes are glazing over the text or something. That at least that's helpful.
Yeah, or you're confused is the other one. And I also ask my beta readers, when you put the book down, because you don't read it in one setting, please just mark, I put the book down. Don't tell me why. You put it down because you want to have dinner. It doesn't matter. You want to see the breakpoints where beta readers are putting your book down because it means there wasn't quite enough to get them to that next scene. And again, if you have multiple ones that pick the same spot, that gives you something to look at and evaluate yourself as a writer without relying on biased information from your beta reader. So I wrote a blog a while back, and I'm trying to think of what else I put in there, but very specific questions to beta readers of what you want from them. And then they do a great job for you because they're not afraid to hurt your feelings because you've asked specifically, I need to know these things.
Yeah. Yeah, but not normally, at least when you're starting out, I really prefer to work with an editor who knows, because editors know what they're doing, and you can listen to them. And as you also said, they are very methodical, and they pay attention to all the details.
Yep.
And it's like, normally I say, we basically approve 90% of what the editor sends back to us when they're editing our novels, because normally they're right, they know what they're doing.
Yep, but not always, right? That's the other caution that I try and tell even everybody I edit. I say, to the writer that they are the artist and it is their story. And my job is to make them think about their story, but not dictate what they should do or not do with it, right?
No, absolutely agree with that, for sure.
You won't hurt my feelings as an editor if you just go, nope, I'm not making that change. And stand up for yourself as a writer, that it's your story, right? And the editor is one person in the world giving you an opinion on it.
Yes, indeed, I agree with that. But at the same time, it also has to be said that the person giving you opinion on it is somebody who has edited hundreds of novels, right? So it's
right.
It's different from a beta reader or a family member who thinks something.
Right, of course it is, and you should take it seriously and think hard about why you're saying no. And that's why hopefully you hired an editor, because they know what they're doing and you want their feedback on it. But it's also okay to be a believer in your own story.
Oh yeah, for sure. I fully agree with that. But I'm wondering maybe if this is possible, Kristina, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But I'm thinking we covered a lot of ground here, and I think there is a lot of good inputs for listeners. But I'm thinking, would it be possible if I told you that you could only give 3 concrete and tangible advice that our listeners could take away from this podcast episode and go and implement in their own editing process, like right here and right now?
Yep.
Would you be able to give us 3 things?
Can. In fact, I'm very opinionated on that, of what you should do.
Good.
So this works if you write stories from multiple points of view. My first recommendation is to go and look at who has the point of view for every scene and what's their goal for that scene. Because if they don't have a goal, they're not doing anything. And so you should go through every single scene, count up your point of views. How many do you have? Does your protagonist have the most point of views? Do you have too many points of view of one character only, and it should be in a different point of view? So study your point of views and use it to your best. So every scene, look at it and ask yourself, is this the best point of view for this scene? And I've actually found authors who've changed the protagonist because most of their point of view scenes were from a different character and they were actually writing somebody else's story. And then it became a great story because they flipped it on that one piece.
Right. Cool.
And the goal is very important. They have to have a goal, and the goal has to relate to the story. So it can't be a goal to get a cup of coffee. It has to be some goal that it relates to the story, and there's a consequence that your reader is going to care if they achieve that goal or not. So that's my number one thing for when you're first looking at your characters, go and get your point of view straight. And then the second thing I recommend is look at the purpose of each scene. Ask yourself, why is it in the story? The same question, does the purpose of the scene relate to the overall story? So that's same as goes for character. And you want to look at each scene, and if one scene has too many purposes in it, you're trying to do too much, you might want to split it into 2, quieten it down a little bit. So look for scenes that are a bit chaotic, where there's too many reasons for it to be in the story. It could just be overwhelming to the reader. So that's number 2. And number 3 is choosing the location of each scene. And the important thing there is to ask yourself, what's the emotional impact you want either the character or the reader to feel? And so, for example, if you pick a couple sitting on a hill and there's a thunderstorm off in the distance, that can be quite romantic. So maybe that's the feeling you want there. But what if that couple's on a sailboat in the middle of the ocean? It's not so romantic anymore. It's frightening. And quite often in a newer story or an early draft, I'll see that it's just in somebody's home, or the scene takes place in a coffee shop or in a car or some very standard thing. And so my pushback to the reader is, what do you want your character to feel? Do you want them frightened? Well, what's in your story where you could place them in a location where they are frightened, more than if they're in their home and their family is there and it's not frightening at all for them. So those are my 3. So I'll just backtrack on that. It's who's got the point of view and what's their goal. It's kind of 2, but I'm rolling that into 1. The purpose of the scene and what's the emotional impact you want either the characters or your reader to feel.
This is so excellent, Kristina. I have to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and talk about all this stuff and give all this excellent advice for us authors here.
Oh, it's totally fun. I love it.
So if listeners wants to learn more about you and what you do with Fictionary and all that stuff, where can they find you?
Yeah, so our website is fictionary.co. So not .com, it's .co. And if you're a writer, then you want to look at our storyteller side of things. And if you're an editor, then it's Story Coach. So, I mean, everything about us is on the website. We have obviously an email list where we have a really great ebook that we wrote all about the editing journey. And we wrote it together with Pro Writing Aid and with an editing company called First Editing, who does professional editing. And so the 3 companies got together and we wrote this book on what are all the different phases of editing a novel, when to do them, when to do self-edit, when and why you might want to hire a professional, and how they will help you. So it's a really great book if you're looking for just learning what are all the different types of editing. So what's structural, what's substantive, what's copy editing, what's proofreading, etc., and how to use it in your own stuff.
Okay, that's really good. And Kristina, if you send me the links to the different things, then I will make sure, dear listener, to put them in the show notes so you can just go and check it out from there. So thank you so much again for coming on today, Kristina.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure. I love talking about stories.
All right, so next week, Autumn is back and we are going to go back to the beginning and actually talk about story ideas.
If you like what you just heard, there's a few things you can do to support the AmWritingFantasy Podcast. Please tell a fellow author about the show and visit us at Apple Podcast and leave a rating and review. You can also join Autumn and Jasper on patreon.com/AmWritingFantasy. For as little as $1 a month, you'll get awesome rewards and keep the AmWritingFantasy Podcast going. Stay safe out there and see you next Monday.